Okay, we're going to get the final panel underway. And the panel's actually going to begin with Galia's question. Do we give the answer first, or you give the question first?
You get to ask a question. You want to ask me a question?
No, you ask the first question.
My question was actually for Sylvia, and yesterday we talked about Richard Serra in the context of the Third World and Eladio Dieste, and so the question was, is it possible that there are actually two impulses that are equally valid? The impulse to maximize, as Matthias was saying, maximize the use of resources and solving the most amount of problems and creating things that perpetuate in a good way, generation after generation. And that's one impulse, the impulse that yesterday was discussed as Dieste impulse. And there is the other impulse, the impulse that Richard Serra or the CCTV tower or many other muscular architecture projects have, or art projects have, that is the impulse to advance through form a relationship that has to do with something more primitive, with the kind of caveman, up to just give a title, that impulse to go beyond in a muscular way.
Yeah. That would be a question for Rem, but I doubt that his form came that he wanted to challenge the engineers to find a solution. He created a form, which finally the Arab guys were genius enough to make it work.
Yeah, I mean, this I could take advantage of, because I think we could continue discussion of the previous panel, answering the question like, why do we talk about individual materials, right? And it seems to me that, of course, the agenda here, not at all secret, is that the real materials being focused on are the professional species, architect, engineer. So you have, I mean, maybe different versions of species represented here, continuing a long line of about 40 so far, so the last four, as it were. And I would say that the subtitle of the conference, the series of conferences, Architecture, Engineering, and Materials. I mean, I would like to talk a little bit about that and explain then why we would zoom in on what looks like a material. The first thing to say is sort of like the opposite happens, right? There's a very expanded concept of metal at work here, going from, metals, semi-metals. Super interesting point. Made by Anna today, that that there's also that which is made possible by metal, right? Not just casting, but the whole sort of world made possible by metal. Then there was the entire panel on the atmosphere. So the question of metal becomes the question of atmosphere, and there was the point made that all material is in a dance with atmosphere. So in a way, it's a super expanded concept of metal. So I just want to compress it back down, which is what the conference is meant to accomplish, right? But I want to just compress it back down to sort of put some final questions to the panel, because I think there's quite a long history of architects who make speeches about specific materials. You can do a history of those speeches and so on. I mean, obvious cases would be Frank Lloyd Wright, who devotes specific chapters to each material and advances his particular opinion on them with lots of examples and so on. But there are many others, obvious examples, and sort of more refined versions, like when Louis Kahn tries to imagine what would metal Gothic be, and does some pretty bad drawings of what he thinks it could be, that to his good fortune have been largely forgotten by the field. But behind all of those stories that architects tell about specific materials is the oldest story that we've ever told, which is that our unique ability is to invest the material world with some kind of energy such that it can speak. That very primitive definition of architecture as articulate building that talks. And then in that sense, I think it's important to note that even at this table, but let's say if we imagine all the speakers of the table here, there's been a kind of expanded or a stretching of disciplinary expertise. I mean, clearly, of course, the architect is kind of claim credit for being an intellectual who invests the material world with ideas. So we claim to be ideas people with a certain material competence. The engineer is classically positioned as a material expert with some ideas, but but staying close to the material, and the constructor is understood to be very much in the construction world. And the material aspect of the architect's discourse and the ideas aspect of the engineer's discourse creates, let's say, an overlap. But that's, of course, already a huge expansion of an original confusion of designer and constructor. And so there was literally constructed in time that separation, constructor, designer, but then constructor, engineer, architect. But then within each of those fields, a huge expansion to such an extent that we now face like an extraordinary specialization, and extraordinary levels of expertise can be brought to bear on any one design. And I would like to point out that each of those stretchings was associated with specific technologies. Paper, the industrialization of paper very much played a part in our successful arguments of the architect as somebody who makes drawings rather than buildings, somebody who therefore belongs to the world of the intellectual. Photography, likewise, with a secondary argument made about architecture having a place in the university and the ability to rationalize all production by all architects from all cultures and all times, and so on and so on. And one could argue that the arrival of the computer constitutes one more form, one more capacity to stretch the amount of disciplinary expertise. But of course, almost the opposite is true, that, as everybody acknowledges, not necessarily correctly, that the computer actually offers us the opportunity to collapse all those disciplines back into the same place again. It becomes increasingly difficult at the level of information exchange to make a difference between the person who fabricates material, the person who constructs a building, the person who engineers the building, the person who designs the building, and so on. At the very least, there are sets of platforms that now enable confusions of these respective identities. And so what I want to argue is that it's precisely in that moment that there is some value in focusing on individual materials, because despite the fact that architects make, and perhaps all architects at certain points make, specific arguments about the capacities of specific materials, there is actually a virtual neglect of the subject of materials within universities. And that silence is very long in architecture schools. Now, I know that any school that's half interesting and any architectural teacher that's half interesting says that they're really interested in materials and they've got a huge amount of research on it. And that's true, but that tends to be new materials, polymers, hybrids, and so on. The material world is the great new world, presupposing that the most basic materials are totally understood and represent a somewhat dull platform from which we are now going out into a great experiment. In other words, schools are sort of zooming out in their interest in materials rather than zooming in. And I think the purpose of these conferences is to say, well, let's do a zoom in and see what happens, based on the idea that the thing that we consider to be the most stable and ordinary, steel, glass, concrete, and so on, might have different properties. So I'm going to try to frame this as a question. I mean, I think the thing that makes the architect interesting is that like her special skill is to operate in zones of incompatible forms of information. In other words, the architect has one gift and one gift alone, which is to enter into systems of information that don't belong together, but to nevertheless, within that field of incompatibility, imagine organizations at the most obvious level of forms that actually allow those various ecologies to keep going. So basically, the architect is really, and has always been defined as Vitruvius argued, somebody that knows a little bit about almost everything and not a lot about any one thing, but sort of naively, courageously, stupidly, foolishly, or whatever, leaps into problems that are multidimensional and involve forms of information that can't be connected, and therefore offers society a kind of image of an organization that allows life to go on. And the greatest magic trick of all is to do it all in one material. Because what I'm going to argue here is that while obviously every architectural object, no matter how simple, in fact involves an extraordinarily complex array of materials and assemblages and so on, architects spend more of their time, in my opinion, hiding material than exposing it, because the triumph for the architect is to, as it were, invest all the complexity of the problem that they face into a singular expressive object, and preferably one material, on the assumption that it will then, as it were, radiate its own kind of synthetic clarity and its broadcast ideas. And that's what the architect thinks of as talking. And it's in that sense, I think, that we direct our attention back to materials, not only to sort of say what's cooking, literally cooking in the case of metal, with all of these materials, but you had your shot.
I was waiting for Stephen.
Here's the question. The question is this.
I think he doesn't need a question.
No, it's a question. It's a question, let's say, around which all of these conferences are organized. It takes a while to frame it. The proposition is that, in fact, architecture is extremely fragile, not just in the most obvious sense directly, but fragile as a concept, as an idea. And so it's surrounded by this extraordinary levels of expertise, not just in its production, but also in the taking care of it, the letting it live on, the letting it move. And in that sense, I want to consider the possibility that the question of metal goes right to the heart of that fragility, right? The fragility of architecture. So the simple question is, would you agree that architecture is fragile? Stephen?
I think this conference is not about metals at all. In fact, the exciting thing about the conference, and as was the last conference and the one before that, is a revaluation of values. And I see two arguments in this conference. Energy versus structure. Matthias over there. The whole values of, the problem of buildings today using 40 to 70% of the world's energy as being more important than structure. And therefore, Sylvia Lavin's remark, absolutely right on. I keep thinking, this old statement of Bucky Fuller, how much does your building weigh, is totally last century, and we have to have a completely new way of thinking. Right? That's one line, and I see it kind of going in different directions from different people, but that's a whole revaluation of values, which we have to come to terms with. But the second theme is art versus utility. And what scares me about this conference is that utility would win over art, in a bad way, and we turn into being, sort of pragmatists doing just kind of really economic sheds, with a lot of solar collectors on the roofs, and everyone would go around very, very haughty, and like somehow that they had become more, more moral or something like this. I don't know whether, I was only here one day, but one space in Manhattan you've got to see is Roxy Payne's roof sculpture on top of the Metropolitan Museum, which is this amazing stainless steel space, all welded together, that comes down on all, the little, and I saw just kids up there, people, the whole place was just full of people enjoying this space. And it's a space. It's not a sculpture. It's the largest sculpture that's ever been put on the top of the Metropolitan Museum. Did someone present that yesterday? No one talked about Roxy Payne's piece. I think it's interesting because it's really about space, and it's all, little tiny pieces of welded stainless steel. It's a kind of bridge between, what architects make, space, and I think that kind of connection, would be something that we would have to not lose.
Okay, but what's being lost? Just what if architecture lost art, and the measurers and the quantifiers took over, what would we have lost?
Well, just like this morning when Kenneth Frampton was completely against the sort of spectacle building, and then I turned him around because he really does like the Sydney Opera House after all, right? Which is a spectacle building, a spectacular building
wasn't so cheap.
that changed Sydney and changed Australia. So, I mean, there's something that we lose when we go completely, in a reactionary way, all the way over to the other side.
Right.
Which is not to say I didn't love Juan Hueros's garbage plant. It's so beautiful. It doesn't look like a garbage plant to me, especially at night. A fantastic building, incredible
So
images.
I think he's saying that architecture is fragile.
It is.
Yes, and it is. I agree. It's fragile, but I wouldn't say it's either or. I think if we just have to understand architecture and art has a certain value, but there are other values which as well has to be respected. And the question is about leveling it. And it's clear it should not be that then the values of material minimization, whatever energy, we at the end would live in styrofoam igloos because they are the most energy efficient, but they are not great spaces to live in. So we missed the lecture or the lesson in this case. Yeah. So I would say, Stephen, it's not an either or. It's how sensitive architecture can be to accept other values as well, be embedded in your design.
Werner, what do you think?
I typically agree on what he says. Coming back to your first statement, that this architectural fragility, I think this is an over-mystification of what we are doing in our professions. It's good for PR, but it's a little bit over-mystified. Art versus utility, I would say, and this is what Matthias at least expressed, I hope I understood you in the right way, art plus utility. Art plus utility. But what we are facing actually is a worldwide environmental problem, and we have to look for the answers. Since we have a certain, not only a certain, since we have a responsibility for the upcoming generations. And Matthias several times stated that we are already over the top. And we, at our institute, at our office, we are searching for solutions which we can add to the actual building processes, which somehow delay that process and help you out of that hell which we are facing. This is not a discussion art versus utility. It is a way of creating tools in order to make building more sustainable without losing the art or the comfort aspect at all. And making building more sustainable means make building breathtakingly beautiful and not making the people excusing every morning when they stand up that they live and that they have to have some oxygen intake. Yeah, this is not what we are going for. And if we are searching for solutions which we missed to search over 30 to 40 years, because the answer of the entire architectural world on the first report of the Club of Rome, which stated nothing else than which we learned 2 years ago from the United Nations and which totally shocked us. The answer of the architectural world on the first report of the Club of Rome was a totally neglection of these facts and was a turning into postmodernism.
Yes. 1972.
All right. I mean, I definitely, for what it's worth, agree with that. And my starting position is that we're in a moment of history in which there's a great confusion of who's playing which role. I find many, many times engineers, and specifically technical engineers working on specific sections of the problem, often operate much more in the mode of what we would refer to normally as an artist. And we certainly have many, many of our colleagues, one exception, that have all of the dullness that used to be, the engineer's prerogative. I mean, the engineer, it seems to me, has always had, in this classical stereotype, a real responsibility to in every way seem responsible. And the architect has had the responsibility to appear to be half responsible, to have a little bit technical understanding, but also an ability to defeat that. I think those stereotypes were always artificial, although many of our friends live by them. You only have to look at the clothing of the two groups. But in this particular moment of time, you could be a specialist on energy and transform assumptions about what constitutes the experience of space more profoundly than an architect who has devoted her or his life to space as such. And I think the reverse might be true. We certainly know of the designers who really think of themselves as being working in the dark somewhat, developing perceptions that turn out to be of enormous value from a technical point of view, that they have actually managed to break through also some of the assumptions of the engineering community. And what interests me here is, like, where would metal be in that shift of identities? Like, are we Are we as architects able to liberate some thoughts about metal that are of great value to the engineer and vice versa? And I'm not sure the answer, because I think that certainly on the architectural side of the equation, we underestimate to what extent we work to hide materials. The question of wire was brought up. It's a classic. Architects are deeply phobic of wires, right? I mean, and I know we're in the last decade of wires,
It will be gone.
but nevertheless,
For power.
one can consider that one of a huge epoch in humanity has just passed of the wire, in which an enormous amount of the material world is wire, an enormous amount of the intellectual world was made possible by that wire, and it has never, or very, very rarely, been articulated within the work of an artistically minded architect, right? So we're blind to the very materials that we're celebrating in this conference as our field.
But that's very 20th century, you know. It's all going wireless now. Right?
I know.
I mean, the excitement is that computers might be running on light and not on electricity through transistors, but on light. I mean, this is really exciting, this phase, right?
Right.
The 21st century phase, right? You're working on kind of fiber optic things like this.
But I would say, I think it's not a question if the engineers find the solution for this big question or the architect. I think it's my clear position would be that only the combination of the specialist's knowledge and the vision of the architect, because Stephen has to invent to show the building which allows us to use the minimal input in material to build it and make a great space out of it. That's not what we can do. We are the engineers, he's the architect. So we need a combination of his vision and our support to create this form.
And in China, I have to argue for his geothermal wells, you know? In Chengdu, I went
In China,
to,
you have
I
to-
practically got thrown off the project, but we got the 488 geothermal wells in there in. So usually it comes down to the architect to argue in the last cause. You know?
And in
At least
Denmark,
it does
in
China,
Denmark,
in
he-
China,
in
anyway.
Denmark,
In
he has
Europe,
even
too.
to pay
Also-
it.
Right. In Denmark, to get the geothermal wells, we had to threaten to give $20,000 of our fee to pay for the wells, and they accepted it.
Yeah.
So we have the geothermal wells, but the architect's fee got even less.
So running back to the stereotype, what I'm saying, of course, and I can say it more quickly, is that actually architecture is a form of magic, in the sense that what architects have traditionally done is that they say that they can really make a seemingly inert object speak, right? And I think of course, architects welcome the movement beyond statics in engineering, because it seems to assist this mission, but it is a form of magic. Would you allow yourself to say that of engineering? Is it also a form of magic?
Say engineering was always a form of magic.
No, come on. This is what we try to make out of it, to make us to appear like prophets. But this is not, engineering is a very rational kind of discipline. So I would say, but the question I would...
I disagree.
Okay, that's our different position. Well, that's clear. I would say, but there is so much to talk about than just design, that I think there are a lot buildings can express. There are so many and not only problems, so many questions open, which we need answers for, where different buildings can speak about. That there is no limit, that it has to be whatever, an eloxide aluminium golden facade, because that's the only color the credit card company had in mind.
Yeah. Werner?
There are two things. I would like to come back on what you... I got my private one. Okay. Matthias showed a relatively well-known, but also by many people not really understood diagram, which showed that the energetic input to do the building is about 20%, to run the building is about 70%, to demolish and recycle the building is 5 to 10%, energetic-wise. We do not talk about amounts of materials and so on. If we take the energetic problem and the global warming problems and so on serious, we have to involve the lifetime, means the running time of the building, and aspects of that period of time and its energetic use into the planning process as well as into the building process. We have, up to a certain extent, to integrate recyclability, demolishing aspects into the planning aspects. Means the group of people creating intellectually and then putting that into drawings and written papers, a building will become much bigger. We will have people from, how would we call that, experts from how to run the buildings, experts on how to demolish and to recycle the buildings, etc., which will make the entire process more complicated, which will necessitate that we learn another language, we as planners. We sometimes have difficulties that the engineers understand each other's and that the engineers understand the architects, vice versa. Now we have minimum 2 or 3 groups with different languages, with different value systems, with different educations, which will sit on the table and heavily influence what's going to be created. This is the one thing which is of importance. But I'm looking positively forward onto that because I think we can learn a lot and it will be quite fruitful for our doing. However, the headline is always art and utility. Then there's the thing with the rationalism of the engineers. Of course, what we are doing is at the very end, since all our doing is a prediction. You will say the energetic need will be X and Y. We would say the building stands up under all wind and earthquake conditions. This is always an anticipation on paper on what will be built and opened and used a couple of months or years later on. But the final proof is on a very rational basis. Before it comes to that final proof, when we go into the phase of the invention of the building and the invention of new strategies, new materials, new types of constructions, new type of energy collection and storage and release and so on, then it's very irrational. I just want to remember there's a famous book by an American called Ferguson, which is called The Inner Eye. And everybody should read that because it very nicely and clearly describes the irrational part of an engineering thinking.
I would say the question is it an engineering thinking or a human thinking? Because in this case, we are just humans. And in this case, okay, you cannot, even as an engineer, you cannot separate yourself from your human behavior. So therefore, I would say there's definitely a side of the rationalism. There's something which is emotion, which is whatever, which is vision. And definitely there are engineers which have visions. And it's clear, I would say, in my buildings, most of the clients I get convinced not by the numbers, by my vision. So in a certain way, getting a spirit
So
to
we
a
agree
client.
again.
So you agree, but I'm of course always interested in this positioning of engineers on one side and humans on the other. And I feel the same way
This
about...
is something I don't agree.
I feel the same way about architects, and perhaps that's why we are linked together, but I think it seems one could also argue that it's very human to calculate, that it's very human to rationalize. So, but instead we associate being human with the loss of those things. And I think this is why I think, for example, clearly, if this table goes from magic to non-magic, Stephen is clearly magic. He works with a form of magic. There's a sort of a miracle implied in each project, but there's a huge amount of science that is actually enabling, as it's probably always been true of magic, but there's a lot of science that enables that, what you call that leap beyond what even the architect can predict, nor what the person who's experiencing it can predict.
Yeah, but he cannot recalculate his vision of the space. He has to build it. So, in a certain way, there is no chance, in my understanding, for an architectural vision to be proven by calculation.
Okay, so this gives me a chance to ask the final question and then questions from the audience. Because it seems to me in this world that's being described, a world in which, in my opinion, there will be, let's say, using the metaphor of cloud computing, there will be a continuous cloud of expertise that surrounds every object. and will never leave the object behind, because precisely following the chart of the 20% energy for building and 75% recycling, the cloud will never leave it behind. And that seems to me one of the implications of a strong commitment to recycling, is that experts will never leave an object alone. They will actually keep hovering around it, analyzing it, and so on. So we will lose the previous paradigm in which there's a kind of reflection, analysis, a little bit of testing, and then the object is launched, and then you move on to another object, another test. I think we're much more in a situation of a continuous blurring of the relationship between our own private laboratories, the studio of an architect, the laboratory of an engineer, and the building site itself. And there'll be an extraordinary fluidity of physical tools actually shared between the two. We will likely, as has been suggested by many people on the panel, be designing and simultaneously at multiple scales in a kind of parallel processing mode. There may well be some open source elements to this, that pieces of colleagues' experiments are drifting in and out. We will certainly be beyond statics, as has been pointed out. There will be endless redefinitions of what optimization means, and there'll be, as it were, an absolutely continuous research environment. And in this sense, I think, again, I want to kind of just ask one more time the question of metal within that context. Like, is metal, I mean, one conclusion from listening to the brilliant papers would be to say metal might be a kind of super good example of this new phenomenon, but there's a kind of a strong voice saying no.
I would say it's a good example, because typically, especially in steel, even in science, they don't talk about consumption of steel, they talk about usage of steel. So it's an element you bring into a cycle, and it's in there, and you can reuse it. And that's the totally different, definitely the difference to concrete, where this is not as easy to do. And it's as well a big difference, I would say, as well to glass. So therefore, I think metal in that respect is a kind of resource which keeps a lot of its value even when you melt it down, because then you have the base to build the new one out of it.
Stephen?
I'm worried about the word recycling when you attach it to buildings. I think we really need to think about building cities. We need to think about the possibility of programmatic flux and programmatic change. And I'm really happy to be building on a few campuses where the university states up front, the building must last 100 years. So right from the get-go, you want to make a space of great light, great ventilation, great volume, great possibility to change. You don't look that carefully at the program, because for 100 years, you know they're going to renovate, and they're going to, the program's going to change. So, you know, when you start out with a priori idea that you're going to recycle the building, that makes me very nervous. I think in terms of building cities, and especially campuses, and there should be something, you know, another attitude, another value system. Maybe you can recycle parts. Certainly you can recycle carpets. I'm totally in favor of all that cradle to cradle stuff. Very good.
Yeah.
But the building itself, I take another position, and that's that the city, the armatures of the city, the space of the city, the possibility of good, great light and space could be built and lasting 100 years at least.
A city, yes, but if you think on urban sprawl,
No, we have to scrape that and replant it as a landscape.
Yeah, exactly, but there are still the quarries in respect of materials, because you can kind of take these buildings down and use the material to densify the real cities.
Yeah. As you know, Bucky Fuller said of Manhattan that it was a farm, and skyscrapers were a crop that every now and then needed to be just turned over and redone. But let's go to the audience for questions. I, by the way, vote for metal because of its alchemical connection, that I think is actually particularly good material to think about the new fluidities in the way in which we think about objects. Whether it will end up symbolizing that or just be one symptom of that, I don't know.
While the auditorium is thinking about adequate questions, I could add a word to you about recyclability and so on. I do not anticipate that the buildings we are doing are going to be teared down after 5 years or 10 years or whatever. But the building industry is contributing, at least in Central Europe, and I would estimate it's not very much different in the United States. 50% to the mass waste production, which is something. And when we look at the building as a system, we have to look at it as a system from a certain standpoint, then there's a structural load-bearing system which can last for hundreds of years. This is no problem if we design it in a relatively flexible way. There's a facade which does not last 100 years. At least a certain part of the facade, which is the windows and so on, needs to be exchanged after 20 to 30 years. So we have lifetime number 1, which is the structure, and we have lifetime number 2, which is parts of the facade. If we look about heating, cooling, and other system, the lifetime is in the range of 10 to 15 years. So we have another lifetime span in a system number 3. If we look about local communication things, of course we will overcome the wire technology, but actually the buildings are filled up with wires, and these technologies, they jump into another generation every 2 or 5 years. So this is the lifetime circle number 4, and I could extend it. Means real sustainable building have to take this into account and have to make exchange of certain parts relatively easy or repairs of certain parts relatively easy. And if you then take those elements out, they should be, of course, reusable or recyclable. This is what is behind.
Who has the first question? Yeah.
You talked about utility and art in architecture. And you talked about it in a way that you implied that buildings were either utilitarian or art, which is not true, of course. Some are more utilitarian, some are less. There are buildings that are objects as symbols and that have a use, like the CCTV tower. There's also buildings that are more symbolic and have less use, like the Statue of Liberty. In the sense of recycling and using materials, the question is if we start to think of buildings as using materials economically, and if our forefathers had thought that way 150 years ago, we probably wouldn't have the Statue of Liberty.
Why?
Because it's not utilitarian enough, and it doesn't use materials effectively, right? I'm just throwing that idea out for discussion. How do you resolve
tricky
that?
example, right? It just got retrofitted for energy reasons, so you could argue both ways. What do you think?
We might not have the Eiffel Tower either, which looks terrific today. I was just there, kind of 6 months ago, and the lighting at night when you go up and the space that's formed, but there's an enormous amount of steel in that structure.
That's fine. It has been added by the architects, by the way. The original design from the engineers looked different, and all
Right.
those heavy arches below it
We're
has
glad
been
the
added by
engineers
the
didn't win
architects
over.
in order to make a piece of art out of it. I can say that since I'm both.
Yeah.
So, Charles, I think it's not a question either do State of Liberty or not to do them. I think there will be always a number of buildings or number of objects which are in a certain way, out of the standard rules. But the question is, if our forefathers have been sought on in respect of what are the costs, what are the real costs of resources, of materials, our cities may look different. Because what we heard yesterday, like all the material and metals as well spent on infrastructure. That's such an investment in materials, and I can't remember his name. He calculated if you introduce rules to reduce traffic by 10%, all the bridges in New York last for another 15 years. So in a certain, you save billions of dollars in that respect. So I think we have to think as well more in the whole kind of city aspect, which includes building and infrastructure.
And mobility.
Yeah, and mobility, and then it's clear all the suburbs are easily, if you really load them with their real price for the society, they are easily out. They're too expensive.
Mhm. But what you just said is a form of is a form of data visualization, right? You took the statistics and drew from it a singular formal consequence about the life of those bridges. And I think why I belabored that point at the beginning is I think that the architect is, by definition, some kind of data visualization expert, has always been. And I think the real answer to the question, this room, for example, is neither utilitarian or artistic, right? It's in some netherland between the two. It's some, as we know, some kind of thermal experiment.
Freezing cold, yes.
And if one of the primary roles of the architect is to change the value of materials, which I think has been demonstrated by speaker after speaker, all questions like art versus utility are up for negotiation and dynamic negotiation between experts concerned with the built environment. And I think that, as Stephen said, the very meaning of words like recycling will be what gets crafted. Those words will be shaped like artworks, in my opinion. Who is the next question? Maybe somebody different, just to kind of give us a rhythm here.
I went into architecture because I was interested in the idea of permanence. And I think the nature of metal as a material can be problematic, and it can have great potential as a permanent material. And I'd like the panel to address this and the issue of permanence.
Nothing is permanent.
So that's one for fragility.
I don't know what to say. As Matthias said, it is permanent in the way that you can reconfigure it into another shape, into another use, by remelting it and so on. I do not know whether there's any methodology to destroy metal and to make plastic out of it. I don't think so. So metal stays metal.
Yeah, metal stays metal. On the other side, it might be we already have digged or processed enough if our future buildings get more efficient that we can, by whatever, deconstructing one, we can build 10 new ones out of the material resources. That would be the...
Yeah. And I'm sorry to answer it my way, but permanence is an idea. And it's certainly an idea that architects have historically been called on to produce images of, fantasies of, but it's very much an
I
idea.
could amend my question to say relative permanence.
Yeah, but even relative permanence, it's an idea, and we have applied all of our artistic expertise to try to craft images of permanence. Why were such images of value? Because permanence itself is nowhere evident. We do not live in a world of permanence. So in some senses, architecture has had it has been perhaps the classical role of the architect to produce images of objects that seem to defeat time, and therefore offered some degree of comfort, psychological comfort. We're actually not great, until recently perhaps, on actual comfort. But in terms of a sort of a culturally reassuring image of permanence, we have some gifts there. And I would say the very flux and fluidity, or potential flux and fluidity of metal, has made of metal a very special challenge in terms of permanence. I think you've asked the question really well, and that's why I love that panel on oxidation so much. And I want to remind you of one of the important arguments that was made by Anna Dyson, that not only are buildings instantly decaying from the moment you launch them, and therefore you've got to think about that, but the technologies with which they were designed and even the parametric systems with which she herself was using, they're also decaying at the very moment that they were being produced. So in that very, very dynamic world, you have the architect with this double mission of wanting to create images of permanence, but also wanting to make objects talk, which requires a little impermanence. And we really work with that, and we work with that with great mystery and joy. And I think that what's so great about them at this particular moment is side by side with you are engineers who are equally amazed at what they're able to work with and the ways in which they're able to work. And I think that's a dance. So the answer to your question might come out in 10 years. There might be another concept of permanence in a world of kind of compulsory responsibility towards recycling, for example. there would be a different concept of permanence. And maybe the recycler is that, is somebody who's thinking in those terms.
Also, I have to say that the buildings that I remember that were supposed to be permanent, a lot of them have been torn down. And a lot of the buildings that are supposed to be temporary, like the Eiffel Tower, are still standing.
Right.
We did the storefront, that's a temporary structure.
Right.
They rebuilt it to make it more permanent. I
Right.
mean, it's almost like you put a building out in the world and the opposite happens of what you think is going to happen. Like the Eiffel Tower was only supposed to
So
last
which means society
15 years.
decides. Society
Yeah.
decides.
The
if it's
society,
permanent.
the architect won't decide, the society will decide what's more permanent. The relative permanence will be decided by whether the people like it or not. Obviously, we liked the Statue of Liberty, so we had to restore it because the whole thing was rusting, right? The whole thing had to be restored. The structure inside, all the skin outside, we liked the building, we restored it.
I totally agree. So it comes to my concept of permanence, which is doing ephemeral architecture. It can be permanent or it can't. It depends on what the upcoming generations judge and decide on.
2 votes for fragility. Gary.
Fragility. Should make
I wonder if I could offer a lighthearted observation about the sense of permanence and really permanence. Permanence being a series of transformations. If it lasts in 100 years by going through 3 or 4 transformations, that's permanence. And I'd like to preface this by referring to a comment that one of the lecturers made yesterday. She said she couldn't imagine Louis Kahn looking at a piece of steel and saying, this steel wants to be what? For better or for worse, we live in a disposable age. And much of what's disposed is metal. Fortunately, much of what's recycled, in fact, virtually all of what's recycled in metal goes into building products. One of the biggest items there are automobiles. In fact, the automobile is almost the larva stage of the adult steel beam because steel beams are almost 90% recycled material, much of it automobiles. So the question really isn't, would Louis Kahn look at a piece of metal and say, what does this metal want to be? It's, would Louis Kahn have looked at an automobile and said, this automobile wants to be a steel beam?
That's the future for General Motors.
Earlier Mark mentioned these Gothic shapes that Louis Kahn drew in the idea of making metal into Gothic forms. I actually have those drawings. I own those. I own these 3 drawings. I bought 3 drawings from someone in San Francisco, and every morning I see them over my watercoloring desk. And it's really true. He was really trying to do Gothic architecture with steel, big steel tubes, enormous. And it was for Philadelphia. It's an urban plan for Philadelphia. There's 3 sketches. It's in Perspecta, one of the early Perspectives. Anyway, I happen to own those 3 drawings, so I see it every day. He really did care to see what steel could do as Gothic.
Right, and the context for that were the discussions in New York about new monumentality.
Yeah, exactly.
And gets back to your permanence thing, that in a modern world, what would permanence mean? And that was his answer. I mean, I got mixed feelings about the results.
That's a very interesting conference to look at, 1944.
Yeah. Does somebody want to answer a question from that side? Or are you the judges and this is the... Yeah.
Getting back to your comment about recycling, it seemed interesting that you sort of seem to have 2 notions of recycling. One, that it was sort of a scary prospect that we should think of buildings as being recycled as they're being designed. But at the same time, you said society chooses what will stay and what will be permanent. So isn't it the job of the architect to ensure that the building has the ability at the same time, or doesn't have the ability, that it can be the Eiffel Tower and, not be permanent, but end up being permanent? I'm not sure how to phrase the question properly.
In principle, you cannot decide on that. If you look at new airports, for example, in Europe or all over the world, they change permanently because there's Schengen and non-Schengen, and there's another terroristic wave or not, and there's another rumor that there might be some terroristic attacks or not, and they permanently build and rebuild and add, and This is an ongoing construction site, every airport. For example, just taking one example.
I think the only thing what we can do, in maybe not only the architect, the whole design team, is that we choose a construction which on one side can last long, but if you have to dismantle it, it can be dismantled and sorted in pieces, and you don't have combined materials which are not able to take apart and which you have to dump.
Yeah, I think we talk too much about recyclability. If you look on a new Mercedes-Benz, it's totally recyclable, but you don't talk about it. And this is what should be an underlaying or overlaying aspect on all architecture. It should last forever, but in case it becomes critical, it should be totally recyclable. Point. I think we should focus a little bit on aesthetics.
Yeah.
And the chance is given using metals in a new way of treating them in order to create another type of surfaces, reflections, sound absorbings, heat radiations, and whatever. I think this is a very interesting thing too.
Yeah.
Because up to now, up to whatever the year 1995 or 2000, metals typically have been used as they come out of the mill, as flat ware, as we call that, as sheets or as beams, and so on and so on. But options to treat them from hydrojet cutting to laser cutting to bending, double bending, curving, and so on, laser welding, they have been developed in the machine industry in the last 10 to 15 years, and now they slowly crawl into the building industry. And beyond the effect of decoration, I do not want to make that thing that decorative elements, but I think there are a lot of chances given which at the same time combine structural, thermodynamical, and other positive effects. If you remember the one slide I showed with the sponge type macro bubble thing, I think there are so many chances in that. It's load bearing, it's wind directing, it is shadow providing, it is a piece of beauty. You just can use this as a wall and look at it for the end of your life, and so on and so on. If we talk about the fabrics, so many chances with metals.
So maybe a last question?
This is a minor footnote of things we've been talking about, the element of time and use of material, because personally I think there's a nostalgia involved with material at the time that it was used. For example, wood at the time of primitive men, post and beam construction, stone, cathedrals, we think of glass, you think about Mies van der Rohe and modernism, and metal now that is so interesting for us because it morphs into many things. But all of them sort of have association with the time element, and it's representative of our history, our culture, and in that architects, I think, have this X variable of time that when the material they use, it becomes representative and relative to the identity of their time and history and what you're making at that time in the moment. That, say, 10 years past the construction of their building, people are looking at it with a certain nostalgia, saying that, for example, so-and-so used concrete in their building, Corbusier, or titanium used by Gehry. And that, so I think material has a certain nostalgia given the X variable, which is time element. It's just a footnote.
I think it's a good point because, for example, if you take titanium, Frank Gehry chose titanium for Bilbao because at that time the eastern part, the USSR broke down. So this was because this material was available. If the system would kept up, the price wouldn't be affordable to do it. So his first idea was to do it in copper. So in a certain way, I think titanium buildings are in a certain way exactly reflecting a certain period of time. And I think, therefore, maybe other materials, and I think that's as well the aesthetic Werner is talking about, maybe new materials using metal. I can think on using metal as coatings on other materials where you can as well have to think about how you get it, how you dismantle it afterwards. Yeah, but definitely there might be a time when now we change into other materials which will frame a certain a certain time period, and it's clear steel, as steel construction, is typically as well describing a certain time period.
Really?
Yeah.
You're back to agreeing on everything again.
I just thought 5 seconds long, and then I thought I couldn't make it better, so I agree. Yeah, of course, but yeah. See, the steel we are using comes out of the first industrialization point. Actually, we are facing the third wave. After the silicium area, we are entering the sustainability area.
So Stephen, what would be your vision for the next material after Corten steel?
Well, I'm very curious why the next one's going to be about plastics when they're building this fuselage out of carbon fiber. You know, I'm from Seattle. They're building this Boeing fuselage in one piece out of carbon fiber. I mean, this is an amazing... So can we talk about that fuselage? I think it's a fascinating
it's
problem.
polymers.
It's one of the reasons the plane is late, by the way. They can't quite hook the wings onto the fuselage
I read it wrinkles.
structurally
They've used
yet.
it wrinkles.
But it's super light, and it's a very enormously strong material, and I think it's, I mean, yeah, I think that could be the most interesting conference.
Yeah, would
because
you think-
you should just open it up, you know, because who would ever imagine you would build an airplane fuselage out of carbon fiber? 10 years ago, I would have never thought that. I remember when people were trying to do some chairs and failing, you know. I won't name any names, but there were some terrible chairs designed out of carbon
And Stephen,
fiber
you
that didn't work, right?
You would use the plane?
I'm going to use the plane, absolutely. I only fly on Boeing planes, by the way. You won't catch me on an Airbus. The Boeing has a manual overdrive on the controls, right? That means if the electricity goes out, you
By
can
the way,
fly the plane.
I have to
in.
catch my Airbus.
Okay, so I want to just quickly, I think it's a great moment to finish. I want to thank Metalsmiths who did the installation on the 200 level, particularly Rosana Rubio Hernandez, who's the curator, and Alejandro de Castro Mazzaro, who's the assistant curator. Mark Wasuda, director of exhibitions, Luca Farinelli and Annie Coombs, who are in charge of the student-run GSAP exhibitions team, Gabriel Bach, the head of the GSAP Online, the AV crew that were more or less invisible, which is a real testament to them, John Romalo, Lou Fernandez, and Kevin Alley, and especially Annie Curtin, the student coordinator of the Post-Ductility Conference, and the countless students that she managed to trick into becoming part of this operation. To Ben and his team, to Michael, Christian, and their technical advisory committee, fantastic. To Gary and Lewis, I mean, really incredibly strong partners. For myself personally, the Metal Conference was really just amazingly good. I want to remind you that 2 speakers today pointed out, Sylvia Lavin and I guess the 2 historians, Sylvia and Jorge, pointed out that metal has always troubled architectural discourse. It was not considered legitimate. And I think one of the conclusions from this conference is it never did become legitimate, despite the extraordinary role it played through the 20th century. A lot of those 20th century uses are just about to disappear without ever us having fully absorbed the consequences of that. So I think that metal, the future for thinking about metal in architecture is unbelievably exciting and will require all the magic of the speakers at this conference and around. I genuinely believe that we're moving into a kind of cloud form of expertise, and that metal will float through that cloud in extraordinarily different ways, and we'll need another conference. But yes, plastics and polymers and your airplane is on the way. Thank you all.